Hi all. Word on the street is that our enforced confinement is going to last us until the end of July. I think we need a bit of perspective on how difficult our current situation is. Let's hear the words of Hebrews 11:32 to 38. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. Now, I must admit that these verses from Hebrews 11 raise conflicting emotions in me. The first part I really like. I'm reassured by God's awesome acts on behalf of Gideon, David, and Daniel and his friends. But I recoil from the notion of poverty, mistreatment, torture, mocking, flogging, imprisonment, death by stoning, death by the sword, and certainly I do not want to be sawn in two. We might be tempted to think that these people did not experience God's mighty deliverance because they did not have enough faith, but we would be mistaken. After all, the writer of Hebrews refers to them as people of whom the world was not worthy. They are models of faith, just like Daniel and all the people in the hall of faith, even if the outcome of their faith was different. But then again, can we really say that the outcome of their faith was different? Not if we understand these verses in light of what 1 Peter 5:8 to 11 has to say. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. To him be the dominion forever and ever. Notice that the suffering is worldwide. And recognize first that the ultimate outcome of faith is sharing in the eternal glory of Christ. Peter is referring back to the living hope he had described at the beginning of his letter. He's referring to the promise that the tested genuineness of a believer's faith would result in praise, glory, and honor at the revelation of Christ. Each of us have an imperishable, undefiled, and unfading inheritance reserved in heaven for those who put their trust in Jesus Christ. So faith that triumphs is faith that perseveres in the face of any and every difficulty. That's the point Hebrews 11 is making. Whether we or not we experience deliverance in the present is not the issue. The path God sets for his children is not necessarily the same, but we have the same destination. Daniel and his friends experienced God's miraculous deliverance. Peter and Paul died as martyrs for the sake of the gospel, but we can be sure that they all share in the glory of Christ. So will we. Second, the common outcome of sharing in the glory of Christ is not at all in doubt because it is based on God's gracious purposes for his children. That's why Peter refers to God as the God of all grace. Peter is telling us that sharing in the glory of Christ is not something that we somehow have to earn. It is a privilege we receive by the grace of God, freely and sovereignly bestowed upon us. Our faith does not merit God's favor. Our faith is but the empty hand that receives and rests on the promises of God. Moreover, the promise of sharing in the glory of Christ is sure to be fulfilled because it is secured and guaranteed by the redemptive accomplishment of Jesus Christ. Peter says, God has called you to his eternal glory in Christ. The phrase "in Christ" signifies the fundamental reality of every believer's life. Through faith in him, we are united with Christ, who is our representative. All that is his is ours. In his death, we died to sin. In his resurrection, we have new life. In his exaltation, we are glorified with him. And our glorification does not depend on our strength or on our accomplishments, but on Jesus Christ's finished work that has satisfied the righteous requirements of God once and for all. It is ours through faith, receiving and resting on Christ and his righteousness. Better yet, sharing in the glory of Christ does not even depend on the strength of our faith. 1 Peter 1:7 points out that it is not the greatness of our faith, but the genuineness of our faith that is the issue. And genuine faith is a faith that will persevere in the face of trial because it is God-given faith. It is a faith that is enabled and sustained by the gracious work of God in the lives of those whom he has chosen and called to share in the glory of Christ. As a matter of fact, it is a faith that grows in strength as it is exercised through trials. But how can we be sure that God will carry out his purposes? Peter says, after you have suffered a while, God will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. He is emphasizing that God will personally act on behalf of his people. He is trying to reassure us that God is committed to fulfilling his purposes for his people. And God's ability to fulfill his purposes is beyond question because God has a mighty hand. In other words, God has both the will and the wherewithal to accomplish his gracious intentions for his people. Such is the greatness of God's power that even the duration of suffering is under his control. Peter says, after you have suffered a little while, the suffering will end in God's time. And Peter says, God will restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish. He wants us to understand that God is committed to doing us good even though we suffer. Again, it is precisely through these sufferings that he accomplishes his purpose of conforming us to the image of Christ. As he salves the hurt caused by our suffering, we experience more fully his loving care. As our faith is exercised by our difficulties, we are strengthened by his grace so that our confidence in his ability is confirmed. So we become more established in our faith as we learn more fully our absolute need of his grace and his total reliability. So till tomorrow, my fervent prayer is that we would all live in light of this glorious hope of sharing in the glory of Christ, so that we could live faithfully for his glory and for his honor.